Interestingly, the widespread persecution of gay people during the Lavendar Scare instigated the nationalization of the gay rights movement. Because they were ostracized by straight people everywhere, gay people began to congregate more and to form relationships amongst themselves. Not only sexual and romantic relationships, but relationships of friendship and found family as well. Gay clubs like the Mattachine Society sprung up in response to the Lavendar Scare. Although the society's staunch anti-political rules eventually led to its dissolution. When government astronomer Frank Kameny was charged with homosexuality and fired, he sued the federal government. Not on the basis that he was not gay, but on the constitutionality of the ban on gay people in federal government. This effectively reframed the issue of one not of national security, but of civil rights. Frank Kameny started up the Mattachine Society of Washington, where gay members could discuss issues of homosexuality. But because of the fear of infiltration by undercover agents, pseudonyms were used by all the members. The Mattachine Society petitioned Congress for the right to defend their license before the House District Committee, and was granted their request. This would be the first congressional testimony by an openly gay person in U.S. history. Despite listening to Kameny's testimony, Congress refused to overturn the anti-gay rules in place in federal government. Republicans in Congress tried to argue the security risk angle, but when an attorney advised the MSW that groups only had to be licensed if they made more than $1,500 annually in profit, the Mattachine Society stopped fighting Congress and let their license be revoked. Since their profit that year had only been $200, the Mattachine Society could operate unlicensed. Despite the fact that they didn't win their case, the public hearings helped to recenter the Lavendar Scare around civil rights instead of national security. In 1947, Bruce Scott was arrested for suspected homosexuality, although he had successfully avoided entrapment by an undercover officer. When this arrest showed up on a background check for federal employment in 1956, Scott was fired. For the next few years, he struggled to find work in his field as an astronomer. Eventually, with nowhere else to turn, Scott requested legal help from Frank Kameny and the Mattachine Society of Washington. After being denied federal employment for years, Scott filed suit in April of 1963 and was represented by the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU. In 1963, Judge Hart of the U.S. District Court ruled against Scott. Scott appealed the decision. Another case central to the Lavendar Scare, in 1952, Edward Kelly sat on a park bench and struck up a conversation with Frank Manthos. After talking for a bit, Kelly invited Manthos back to his apartment for a drink. Manthos then revealed himself to be an undercover police officer and arrested Kelly for homosexuality. He was convicted in a D.C. court. Kelly appealed his conviction. The U.S. Court of Appeals found that Manthos didn't have enough evidence, and they overturned Kelly's conviction. This set a new precedent. If there was only one witness to alleged sodomy, the court needed some circumstantial evidence to back it up. They couldn't rule based on two people arguing different sides of a story. As a result of the Kelly appeal, conviction rates for homosexuality plummeted. Prosecutors, angry at the Kelly appeal, encouraged police officers to get offenders to touch them rather than just proposition them verbally, so that gay defendants could be charged with assault, not just solicitation. When one police officer arrested a man for brushing up against him after the plainclothes officer had flirted with the man, the U.S. Court of Appeals ruled that the officer had initiated the contact and brushing up against someone did not constitute assault. So prosecutors' entrapment plan also had to be scrapped. For most of the late 1940s and 50s, the Lavendar Scare had rested on the existing idea that homosexuality was a mental illness. At that time, the DSM-1, Psychology's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, listed both homosexuality and communism as mental illnesses, making it easier for the government to conflate the two. It was thought that anyone with one of these mental illnesses had a predisposition for the other. But that began to change near the middle of the decade. After administering a series of psychological tests to 30 gay and 30 straight participants, psychologist Dr. Evelyn Hooker passed the results along to a number of psychologists to analyze in a blind study where they didn't know which test belonged to which participant. The study concluded that all the men were mentally fit. This meant that there was no inherent link between sexuality and mental health. In 1956, Dr. Hooker presented her findings to the American Psychological Association in Chicago. Dr. Hooker's study paved the way for people to do psychological studies on sexuality, a previously taboo idea. As the general opinion of the public started to catch up with the changing opinion of the psychology community, public support for the Lavendar Scare began to wane. From the end of the 1950s into the 1960s, courts started overturning some wartime and Cold War era gay convictions. But in the mid-1960s, the movement turned toward the laws themselves and their lack of constitutionality. In 1960, the Washington Post reported on an absurd story where 3 plainclothes officers had attacked each other in Lafayette Park in Washington, D.C., all trying to arrest each other for homosexual behavior. As the Post pointed out, this incident couldn't have happened if the officers had declared themselves, which was proof that the D.C. Metropolitan Police were engaging in entrapment. These slow revelations and the slowly changing zeitgeist mirrored the expansion of the infant gay rights movement in the U.S. at the time. Because the gay rights movement was so new, part of the issue was getting gay people to be seen as a minority in order to get legal protections as a minority. A large part of the reason that the Lavendar Scare had even happened was because the employment discrimination wasn't illegal since gay people weren't a protected class. In 1964, the ACLU called on the government to, quote, end its policy of rejection of all homosexuals on that ground alone, end quote. It noted that while homosexuality might be a relevant factor in some jobs, it didn't work as a blanket policy. An echo of the Red Scare that defined it, the Lavendar Scare used communism to further their cause. When headlines touting that Cuba had put gay citizens in labor camps went public in the mid-1960s, the Mattachine Society of Washington picketed in front of the White House, comparing anti-gay policies of the U.S. to those of communist countries like Cuba and Russia. In June of 1965, the U.S. Court of Appeals ruled in favor of Bruce Scott. The court stated that unspecified homosexual behavior was not grounds for dismissal, and that burden of proof rested on the prosecution to show that homosexuality had led to other immoral behavior or treason. The Scott case meant that moving forward, those accused of being security risks were entitled to legal discovery by prosecution. This meant that the federal government had to actually acquire evidence of homosexuality leading to immorality instead of just relying on rumor or risk. This also meant that the government had to explain its anti-gay policy. An attempt to do so was made on September 8, 1965, when 5 members of the MSW met with the Civil Service Commission. The CSC claimed that this new idea that homosexuality was an identity was incorrect, therefore the policy was not discriminatory. Because homosexuality was a choice and an action, the policy was about morality. This shift from security to morality on the part of the federal government reflected the recent openness and nationalization of the gay community. No longer could the government claim potential blackmail as an issue because many of the people they were firing had already outed themselves. Except the State Department. The State Department continued to claim security risks. In 1966, the case of Benning Wentworth went before the Supreme Court. The difference in Wentworth's case was he requested his trial be open to the public, and crucially, Wentworth did press interviews. If he was open about his sexuality, how could it be used to blackmail him? Wentworth's very openness began to erode the State Department's already thin reasoning for the Lavendar Scare. Slowly, federal agencies stopped firing gay employees if they were doing good work. The policies of the Lavendar Scare were still in place, but they were sporadically enforced. Then, in 1969, Clifford Norton, a gay man who had been fired from NASA in 1963, was defended in the Supreme Court by the ACLU. He acknowledged in court that he was gay, and the Supreme Court asked the Civil Service Commission to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Norton's homosexuality was a security or morality risk. When the CSC couldn't provide a good rationale, the court ruled in favor of Norton on July 1st, 1969. The Supreme Court had ruled that homosexuality was not, in itself, grounds for dismissal from federal service. The Norton decision became precedent. Prosecution had to show a reasonable and clear connection between an employee's off-duty activities and their ability to do their jobs. Later that same year, on October 6, 1969, the National Institute of Mental Health declared that homosexuality was not a mental illness. By the late 1960s, even the Civil Service Commission had to admit that it was acting against the general zeitgeist. The commission said in a public statement, quote, "Attitudes toward what consenting adults do in private are changing," end quote. Frank Kameny and Barbara Giddings of the Mattachine Society of Washington ran a table at the 1970 APA conference called "Gay, Proud, and Healthy, the Homosexual Community Speaks," about how homosexuality wasn't a mental illness. The next year, in 1971, Kameny and Giddings were invited back to the APA conference for a panel called "Psychiatry, Friend or Foe to Homosexuals, a Dialogue." Giddings read off statements sent in by gay psychiatrists to show that there were people who were both. As a result of that panel, a group was formed within the APA for gay psychiatrists, and in 1973, the APA Board of Trustees voted to remove homosexuality from the list of mental disorders. The APA action in 1973 had a huge impact on the view of homosexuality. Legally, it no longer made sense to exclude this group because they weren't considered mentally ill. That same year, a federal court in California forced the Civil Service Commission to end its exclusion of gay people. In his decision, Judge Alfonso Zirpoli said that, quote, "The notion that it could be an appropriate function of federal bureaucracy to enforce the majority's conventional moral code of conduct in the private lives of its employees is at war with elementary concepts of liberty, privacy, and diversity," end quote. In December 1973, the Civil Service Commission capitulated, issuing a bulletin that declared that homosexuality on its own could no longer be considered grounds for dismissal. It was the final nail in the coffin of the Lavendar Scare. The scare tried to continue a little longer, but while it continued investigating, the government had no legal grounds to fire gay people anymore, and even the investigations petered out eventually. Communism and homosexuality were linked because both groups were making waves and telling American society that it needed to change. At a time that was extremely nationalistic, criticizing the power structure of the country was not approved of. The Lavendar Scare was about more than just how many people were fired. It was about how many people were afraid for their livelihoods and reputations. It was about how many people lived in constant fear of being outed. It was about the public backlash to the very existence of gay people. Although the Lavendar Scare ended in most federal agencies in 1975, it continued in some of them, like the military and the NSA. In 1995, President Bill Clinton signed an executive order banning discrimination based on sexual orientation in the granting of security clearances. And in 1998, discrimination based on sexual orientation in government employment was banned. Back in 1957, World War II veteran and U.S. Army Map Service astronomer Frank Kameny was fired for being gay. On June 29, 2009, Kameny was presented with a personal apology on behalf of the United States government. And on January 9, 2017, Secretary of State John Kerry issued a formal apology to the LGBTQIA+ community for the Lavendar Scare. In his statement, Kerry said, quote, "In the past, as far back as the 1940s, but continuing for decades, the Department of State was among many public and private employers that discriminated against employees and job applicants on the basis of perceived sexual orientation, forcing some employees to resign or refusing to hire certain applicants in the first place. These actions were wrong then, just as they would be wrong today." End quote. The Lavendar Scare was a dark period in American history, marked by mistrust and backstabbing, a period of misplaced paranoia and fear of the unknown. In an ironic but predictable turn of events, it was the heavily oppressive atmosphere cultivated by the Lavendar Scare that fast-tracked the nationalization of the gay rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. The Lavendar Scare coalesced gay people from all over the country into a recognizable community by giving them a common and very visible enemy in the form of the federal government. The Lavendar Scare was the spark that created the organized, nationalized gay rights movement in the US. But because the Lavendar Scare sort of lost steam before it decisively ended, it's hard to call it a rallying cry for gay rights. The Norton decision that effectively ended the Lavendar Scare was overshadowed by the Stonewall riot that took place that same week in June of 1969. Although the Lavendar Scare wasn't the centrifugal force of the gay rights movement, it helped create the nationalized gay community, the first step in organizing toward a gay rights movement. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and tell me what you liked about it in the comment section below. Did you learn something new? Had you heard of the Lavendar Scare before? If you didn't enjoy this video, give it a thumbs down and tell me what I can do to improve. If you're interested in more nerdy history content, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to get notified about new videos, which I post on some Fridays. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. So don't doom yourself. I'll see you next time.